I'm afraid I'm a bit of a pessimist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not so much for the United States, because you're still such a rich and innovative country. But I'm wondering in Britain whether or not, and history plays an important part of this, especially the way in which history is used politically, to wonder whether or not we still believe in ourselves, certainly in the way that we did when I was growing up. I'm going to try and get the statistics right. I think it's 2015, as recently as 2015, maybe it's 2010, 86% of people were proud of British history. That has now fallen down to 56%. And I'm sure that the reason for this is the sustained attack on the British Empire that we were discussing earlier, and people forgetting the part that we played in the abolition of slavery and concentrating just on the horrors and the monstrous things that happened. And we are therefore, if you're not proud of your past, you're not proud of your ancestors, you're not proud of the things that they produced, and Britain has produced some pretty extraordinary and wonderful things for the world, then it's difficult to see why anyone would want to be proud of the future of the country as well. And so I'm pretty pessimistic. And when I feel pessimism for America, it's for things like taking Thomas Jefferson's statue down from the New York City Hall. And it's a form of cultural suicide, it strikes me, not to admire the founders of your nation. And yes, of course, he owned slaves, but he also wrote a constitution that has survived for a quarter of a millennium. And he was brave enough, and Washington and all the others, brave enough to stand up against the most powerful empire in the world. Now, these things, you deserve your statue, it seems to me.
Hey everybody, this is Tim Ferriss. Welcome to another episode of The Tim Ferriss Show. We're going to get started very shortly. What follows is a conversation and interview with Andrew Roberts. He is an incredible historian. He is also a prolific author. And we talk about his creative process, but also lessons learned and life lessons from the subjects of his books, which include Napoleon and Churchill. We cover a lot of ground. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. You can find his full bio, many more links in the description. And here it is. Well, pleasure to meet you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Tim, for having me on this show.
I thought we would start with Cranleigh after your A-levels.
Did you now?
What happened? What
did you know? That's the way you're going to kick off. That's the way we're going to make friends and get on with each other.
Roll up the sleeves and just get into it.
You're going to mention the reason that I was expelled from school, or at least I'm going to mention the reason because you don't know.
I don't know the reason.
Oh, absolutely. Good. Okay. Well, I don't think I'm the first person ever, as a young man, to get drunk and climb up buildings. You know that.
Absolutely not.
Thank you.
Time-honored tradition, I think.
Hallelujah that I'm not the only person this happened to. But quite understandably, the school chucked me out before I fell off one of them. You know, and they'd have got blamed. And it led to actually one of my wife's most brilliant witticisms. She's a very funny woman, my wife. And she said, yes, and all Andrew's done since in life is to get drunk and social climb.
That is clever.
It's not bad, is it?
All right, well, we might come back to that.
Yeah.
It seems like also, maybe it's hard for me to tell given the British school system, although I did go to St. Paul's in New Hampshire where they do have the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th form and so on. So that much I know. Yeah. But I think in the same piece where I found the Cranleigh bit in doing the research, also found a note that you were approached as a possible candidate for MI6 a bit later on.
No, that was when I was at Cambridge.
Cambridge.
Yes, absolutely. That's the right time to be approached for MI6, is because Cambridge and MI6 have had a long and fairly disastrous career, needless to say. All of the worst spies in the 1930s, traitors of the 1930s went to Cambridge. But yeah, it was a fascinating thing. I was just going down from university, and somebody in my college, one of the dons there, who's still there actually, come to think of it, approached me and said, how about it? Would you be interested in in becoming a spy. And so automatically, needless to say, you just think of yourself as James Bond immediately. You know, that sort of dun-dun-dun, dun-dun-dun, dun-dun-dun is going on.
Kicks off.
And the soundtrack in the back of your brain, you're automatically there with your Beretta and the beautiful women and all of that kind of thing. But I then had to actually do the process of where you need to join, which I did get through. And it was completely hilarious. I mean, you couldn't satirize it, basically. They asked you things like there were hundreds of questions and you had to answer them very, very quickly. And some of them were things you'd expect, like, you know, what are the 5 longest rivers in the world kind of thing. Put them in order and all that. But there were also things like place in order of social precedent, Prince, Duke, Viscount, Marquis, Baronet. You know,
I'm out.
Well, exactly. Yeah,
I would have thrown in Cookie Monster. I wouldn't have gotten anywhere.
You're American. You're allowed to. That they're not going to ask that in the CIA. But for some reason, in MI6, this was, I hasten to add, back in the sort of mid-1980s. That was one of the questions.
What did the Don think made you a potential candidate?
Well, that also was a little bit annoying, really, because he told me later about how he had been interviewed by MI6. And one of the things he'd been asked is, and is Andrew a kind person? And this person said, no, not really. And he saw the person interviewing him put a tick in the margin next to the question.
Wonder if that made you more or less desirable.
Much more desirable as far as they were concerned. They ticked the thing.
Right.
I know. I can understand. Well, James Bond, he's not a kind person, is he, really?
No. We view them as disposable pleasures. Well, perhaps. So let's see if we can take off the initial layers of the onion with respect to history. Christopher Perry, Mr. Christopher Perry.
Yeah, a wonderful man.
Who's that?
He was my first history teacher when I was at prep school, which in the English version means when you're sort of 10 to 13. He's dead now, but he was a inspirational history master. He taught history in the way that I think it should be taught, in a narrative way of explaining really, you know, what happened next and why. He believed in the great events, the great sort of wars and battles and things like that. And he was a kind man. He wouldn't have made it into MI6. But he was a sort of old school history master of the best possible kind.
What characterized that? You said narrative, but maybe would you be able to contrast the status quo as it goes in terms of teaching history and then how his style most differed from that?
He taught it as the most exciting story you're ever going to hear, basically, which has the extraordinary added advantage of being completely true. He'd sort of sit cross-legged on the table and give you the voice of Charles I and then the voice of Oliver Cromwell, you know, Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots. He would entrance you with the excitement of the unfolding story, every word of which would be true. It would have loads of dates in it. At the end of the term, each of the terms, the semester, you'd be tested on 300 dates, and not a child in that class didn't get at least 298 of them right.
That's wild.
Extraordinary way of teaching. And he did it entirely through inspiration rather than through, you know, just sort of standing there on a blackboard ordering people to remember, you know, what happened in 1356 or 1415.
Did he have any theater background?
You'd have thought, wouldn't you? You'd have thought.
Because just sitting cross-legged on the desk is going to get a requisite minimal amount of attention from the students, which is brilliant.
Automatically, of course, exactly. No, I mean, now I come to think of it, of course he was overacting from day one, but he didn't seem to be at the time, at least as far as the 10-year-old Andrew Roberts was concerned.
Yeah, we have a sort of rental library behind us in this room that I've rented, and one of the books sitting over there, The Power Broker, does an amazing job of end-of-chapter cliffhangers. That's, I think, Robert Caro over there.
And he managed to make, you know, urban development. Essentially, that book's about urban development,
100%.
isn't it? And he managed to make that interesting. But you've got a few other ones. You've got a great friend of mine there, Neil Ferguson, writing about, in his book, Colossus. You've got some pretty interesting people, a few people that I've met. You might have rented it, but it's a pretty good bunch
It worked
of
out.
books. Yeah,
And it's also quite surreal that Neil is featured here, since he is, I'd say, partially responsible for us meeting in the first place.
yeah. He told me definitely to go on your show. He said loads of people watch it, and you've got a good sense of humour. We'll see.
We'll see about the
later.
sense of humor.
We'll see later whether or
Yeah,
not
the
that
jury
turns
is
out
out.
to be
The
true.
jury is out. I found in writing history, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I believe you've said before that you're cautious around the words perhaps, maybe, possibly, especially probably.
Yeah.
Could you explain why?
Don't use them. They're cheat words. What they're saying to the reader is, I haven't worked hard enough on this. I don't know. I'm going to just come up with some kind of theory here, and bear with me. You shouldn't do that. The person, if the person's paid $40 for your book, he or she is going to want to think you know what you're talking about. So if something is a great story and you're not sure it's true, but nonetheless it's funny, or it shines a light onto personality, or for some reason there's a great reason why you need to put it in the book, there are loads of ways that you can hint to the reader. You can say, it is said that, or the story is told that, or anecdotally people stated that, and that's the signal to the reader. This is probably not true at all, but
Someone's
nonetheless,
hedging their bet.
but it's too good to leave out. But perhaps, probably, and maybe, and so on, there you really are hedging your bets, and I think it breaks the bond of trust that you need to have with your reader.
Would you mind speaking to the importance of steady nerves or self-control in crisis? It seems that that's something that recurs. And the reason I'm asking about it is, this would be, I suppose, a sub-question. How much of it do you think is nature versus nurture also? But feel free to take that in any direction you like.
Both Napoleon and Churchill were educated in war. They both went to military colleges. So as their level of command grew, as they grew older, the sense of responsibilities they had, the number of men essentially that they were controlling, increased exponentially. So they had the intellectual background, they had the training as well, and as young men in both cases, they thought a lot about war, about Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, and so on. They had a egotism, to look at it in a negative way, but a self-confidence to look at it in a positive way, that gave them the ability to take these shatteringly important decisions. And so I think it's much more nurture than nature. In both cases, as far as they were concerned, there was a sort of holy fire that they both had. There was not holy in a religious sense, obviously, because neither of them were at all religious, but in a sort of deeper spiritual sense, a belief that what they were doing was so good and right and proper and had to be done, that they were not kept up awake at night over even the death of friends. Death of friends that they were responsible for.
In the cases of Churchill and Napoleon, we could bring up other names, or I suppose I'm using the royal we here. You could bring up other names. Were there particular philosophers or writers that they found particularly instructive, who they leaned on in some sense, that they found solace in? Were there particular minds?
Well, certainly Churchill did, because he was a huge reader. He was a massive autodidact. He never went to university, and so therefore, when he was a young subaltern in India in his early 20s, he sat down and read the greats, philosophers as well as writers, and he was particularly influenced by Gibbon and Macaulay, the two great 19th century historians, English historians, and that affected his writing style, and of course later his oratorical style, but also his outlook on life, philosophical outlook on life. With regard to Napoleon, he was even more literary, really, because he also wrote short stories and books and so on. And so he was very much affected by what he read, again, as young man. And in both cases, they were reading so much that it slightly cut them off from their contemporaries. Napoleon, didn't have many friends when he was in his early 20s. And Churchill, when the other people were off sleeping in the midday heat of India, his colleagues and comrades, he'd be sitting there reading, Schopenhauer and Gibbon and Macaulay and so on.
How did Gibbon and Macaulay inform his philosophical leanings?
They made him into what was called at the time a Whig. We don't have them today, obviously. They were sort of, in modern sense, I suppose, liberal conservatives who believed in noblesse oblige, in the importance
What
of...
is that? I'm sorry.
Noblesse oblige, it's almost a medieval concept where your duty, if you have privilege, is to work for the greater good of the community, to protect widows and orphans, it's a sort of like the knightly chivalric concept that you get from the Middle Ages. And they very much believed in that, and so did Churchill.
Let me ask about Napoleon. So I know shockingly little about Napoleon. I'm embarrassed to admit, and I do want to ask more about Churchill as well. But you've described him as the prime exemplar of war leadership. Why do you say that?
There are lots of military leaders who can do a lot of things, but he was the only one that I can think of who could do all of them. Of course, it helps if you're winning. In the last 3 years of his military career, he was losing. But even when he had far fewer troops, when he was retreating, when he was defending Paris in the 1814 campaign, for example, he was still able to win 5 victories in 7 days in the 1814 campaign. That's 2 years after the retreat from Moscow. It's quite extraordinary capacity. And he was able to win whether he was advancing or retreating, whether he was defending a town or attacking it, whether he was attacking on the right or left flank, or sometimes straight through the centre, as at Austerlitz. He had that capacity, that mind for military conquest, but also, of course, the greatness that was required completely to revolutionise French society. People think that the French Revolution revolutionised society, the clues in the name, as it were. But in fact, the long-lasting things that actually dragged France into the 19th century were things like the Code Napoleon, which were not a revolutionary concept. They were a Napoleonic concept.
This may seem like a lazy question, but since I'm operating from a deficit here with respect to knowledge of Napoleon, what do you think it was that allowed him to be a decathlete of war, as it were, being good at all of these different facets? And I think of how we might analyze different athletes and what allows them to exercise the capabilities we see.
Yeah.
Sort of breaking it down into its component parts. But how would you describe what enabled him to do that where others were unable?
It was inspiration, but also perspiration. He really did put in the time, thinking about it and reading about it. By it, I mean warfare. And of course, he'd been educated in it. He read the key books. There's a guy called the Comte de Gerbert, who in 1772 wrote a book about strategy and tactics. And he, 30 years later, put these into operation. And so he was able to spot the sort of best of the best when it came to modern thinking and or in this case, 30-year-old thinking, in fact. That didn't matter because the weapons of war hadn't changed in the intervening period. And he was able to put those thoughts and ideas into practical use. Classic example being the core system. And what
was it called?
It's called the core system. It's
CORE.
CORPS.
Oh, there you go.
And what he did was to create mini armies, essentially, which were able to march separately, but converge and concentrate for the battle. And so one of your corps would engage the enemy, and then he would use the other corps to outmaneuver and envelop the enemy, sometimes double envelop the enemy. It was a brilliant concept, and Actually, the Allies didn't start beating Napoleon until they had also adopted the corps system. Huh. And so he was always at the cutting edge of thinking of the new concepts. But at the same time, he had very old-fashioned views about how to excite the men. I mean, victory obviously is the best thing when it comes to exciting men. Exactly. Nothing much works better than that. But as I say, he was still winning at the end of his career. But he had this belief that to appeal to the soul was the way to electrify the men. And so he was able to do that. And some people who he was against, the Duke of Wellington, the British general, being the classic example, who won the Battle of Waterloo against him, wasn't interested in electrifying the soul of the men at all. He rather despised his ordinary soldiers. But nonetheless...
You're talking about Wellington or Bonaparte?
The Duke of Wellington, he had some sort of choice negative remarks about his about his own soldiers. And he was a rather sort of stuffy aristocrat. But they loved him because he cared about how many of them died in battle, you know, and he never lost a battle as well, which is a very useful thing in a commander, needless to say. But he didn't try. He didn't go out. He would think it beneath him to go out and try to inspire the men. Whereas Napoleon, his choice of hat and his grey coat and his way of taking off his own medals and giving them to soldiers on the battlefield, and his orders of the day, his proclamations before the Battle of the Pyramids in 1799, he said, 40 centuries look down upon you. And this is an extraordinary thing for a soldier, you know, in Egypt, far away from home. And he looks up at the pyramids and thinks, oh, yeah, he's placing the events of that day in the long historical parabola. And Churchill did that too, by the way, of course, to a great degree. In about 10% of all of the speeches that Churchill gave in 1940, there's some reference to history or the past. He too would summon up the idea that, yes, Britain is on its own, Britain and the British Commonwealth are on their own. This, of course, was in the period before America and Russia were in the war. But we've been in terrible straits before. Look at Sir Francis Drake, look at Admiral Nelson, and so on. And we came through those and won. He also brought up the First World War a lot. And so he too drew on history. And people knew that because he'd written history books and written biographies, including the biography of his great ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, who was with Wellington the best soldier that Britain ever produced, people trusted his view of history.
Instead of biographies, I'd like to ask about an autobiography. So it's my impression that you recommend that young people read My Early Life.
Yeah.
And that there are life lessons contained within it that perhaps might help young people. What types of good advice or life lessons can people expect to find in that book? Or does anything stand out to you?
Resilience is the classic one. Although he doesn't go in this book into criticizing his parents, even between the lines, Churchill was tremendously resilient because his father despised him and his mother ignored him, essentially. But in the actual book itself, he talks about how wonderful it is to be young. 20 to 25, those are the years. He says people will forgive you for mistakes you make in that period. It's not until you're 30 that people judge you on what you've achieved rather than your promise. And he writes about his escape from prison, for example, which, let's face it, there is no young man or woman who hasn't at some stage dreamt about the idea of a successful prison escape. He took part in the last great cavalry charge of the British Empire, and so he writes about what it's like to charge with lancers. He himself had a pistol in a great cavalry charge. It's just the most exciting book, and it draws you along with life lessons that are very good, I think, even for today, at a time when you're frankly unlikely to have to escape from prison or take part in a cavalry charge.
Or you'll just be very unsuccessful at attempting to escape prison with a modern lockdown. I can't let this go. It's sticking in my mind. The core strategy, I'm not sure if strategy is the right modifier for that, but that Napoleon used. It seems like that was waiting to be used.
But it took him to be in the position, of course, of Emperor of France, whereby he could impose it. But equally, there are other things like the Code Napoleon that's not really waiting to be used. He had to sort of work them up into a body of laws that completely revolutionized France.
Now, when he took the writing from 30 years prior and applied it, is it the position that enabled him to do it, or did he think about risk differently than other people? And that is part of what allowed him to implement it.
He'd taken huge risks. He was 26 years old, and according to the Churchill view of life, you can take risks when you're 26 years old because people will forgive you. Actually, the French Revolution government would not have forgiven Napoleon if he'd lost the army of Italy in 1796. But nonetheless, he was a huge risk taker. He would attack when normal generals would have fallen back. He was very lucky in that he was 26, he was fighting generals who were Austrian generals who were in their 70s. And he used to hit the hinge of enemy forces. If you have in an Austrian Sardinian army, for example, he would hit the point between the Austrians and the Sardinians, pushing them both back along their own supply lines and so on. He used psychology a great deal, trying to get into the minds of the generals he was opposed to. He was a great chooser of lieutenants, of divisional commanders and people who he felt he could trust. Superb sense of timing as well in a battle. He was, as I say, the sort of exemplar of so many of the leadership tropes.
Do you think he would have viewed his decisions from the outside that look risky as risky? If someone takes sort of calculated risks over and over again, then you could call them reckless. But at least at face value, that's not maybe the adjective I would use. So I'm just...
Yeah, but they came off. This was the thing. In the Italian campaign, this first great campaign of his, he hardly lost a battle. He fought 20 and sort of won 19 of them. So if you do that, even though you have taken risks, it's a sort of force multiplier in a sense. You wind up thinking that they aren't as risky. He did believe in luck, which was very important. He famously said that he wanted his marshals to be lucky, and he would promote people if he thought they were lucky. And that, of course, runs against everything that we 21st century rationalists can possibly believe in. But, it worked for him.
Yeah, seems to have worked.
Until it didn't.
Until it doesn't.
The decision in 1812 to march on Moscow was hugely risky, and of course it didn't pay off.
Is it true that you have a signed letter from Aldous Huxley?
I do.
All right. Now, Aldous Huxley, I believe...
Aldous, as we English
Aldous. God, I've realized the longer I spend in England, I think I should take TOEFL classes, test of English as a foreign language. I need to brush up on the mother tongue, as it were. He died, if I'm not wrong, the year you were born. I think it was. Why do you have that letter? And what does the letter say?
The letter actually was written from Los Angeles, where he was living in the 1950s. It was in 1959. And somebody just wrote to him asking for his autograph. And obviously also asked, I don't have the letter from the autograph hunter, but he obviously asked for some sort of deep, meaningful thought. The deep and meaningful thought that Huxley gave him, and I'm a huge admirer of Huxley, Eyeless and Gaza, and obviously Brave New Worlds and so on, are wonderful works. And so are his very minor books as well. And he said in this letter that men do not learn much from the lessons of history is one of the most important of all the lessons that history has to teach us. And that is so true, isn't it? There's not a book that I've written 20 books, there's not a book that I've written when I haven't looked across at that framed letter in my study and thought, wow, that is just so perceptive.
Question about the subtitle of your biography on Churchill, which I believe is Walking with Destiny. You mentioned this holy fire, I think is the term you used earlier, but do many of the leaders you've studied have this belief, and I may not be wording this the best way, but of being chosen by destiny in some fashion?
The phrase comes from his remark in the last chapter of the last few pages of his war memoirs, the first volume of his war memoirs, The Gathering Storm, wonderful book. And he's referring to the day that he became prime minister, the day he was appointed by the king as prime minister, which happened to be, coincidentally as it turned out, because Hitler didn't know he was going to become prime minister, on the same day that Hitler invaded in the West, invaded Belgium and Luxembourg and Holland shortly afterwards, of course, to invade France. And he said, I felt as if I were walking with destiny and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And he had a profound sense of personal destiny. Now, you and I might think, again, as 21st century rationalists, that this is a bit sort of mad to think that you're preordained to save, in this case, Britain and civilization. If you said that to me, that was your belief about yourself, I would think that you were clinically insane. But enough things had happened to Churchill in his life. He had had so many close brushes with death that it's not insane to think that. But it's not by any means just... And Napoleon also felt that he had a star to guide him. And he had the luck that we spoke about earlier, but that luck, who was a woman in his case, was somebody he needed to woo and to try to seduce. And of course, in 1812, she turns her back on him and he speaks of her in that sense.
Really?
Which is also a pretty, insane way to look at life, isn't it? But they were both, as I mentioned earlier, devotees of the ancients, of Caesar and Alexander the Great, both of whom also, of course, had this driving sense of personal destiny. And so it does exist in people.
If you could, I'll give you two options. Stand in, meaning take the place of one of the people you've studied in depth, or just simply witness them in a given moment or day or period in their lives, what might you choose?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't want to stand in their place at all. I know that I don't have the intestinal fortitude of these extraordinary people. But would it be the day that I just mentioned? It would be the 10th of May 1940, the day that Hitler's invading. The cabinet meets and recognises that Neville Chamberlain is not the man to continue on the war now that it's turned to the West. And the meetings that took place the previous day and that day, whereby Neville Chamberlain goes to the king and suggests Churchill. And the king wasn't terribly excited about Churchill either, because they'd fallen out over the abdication crisis and he thought Churchill was a bit of a loose cannon. But nonetheless, he's willing to call Churchill. Churchill then goes to Buckingham Palace and becomes prime minister and comes back and starts to organise his government as the news is coming in of the German success and victories on the Western Front. I mean, this is what a day in history that must have been. So if I could be a fly on the wall any day in history, that's the day that I would choose. Can we just go back though to this concept of a sense of destiny? Because of course it isn't just great men as in good men, positive forces in history that has this. Adolf Hitler also had a sense of destiny when he were in providence and luck and being watched over by bigger forces and so on. When he survived his assassination attempt on the 20th of July 1944, when you remember Stauffenberg moves the briefcase with the bomb in it to a point in the table that just shreds Hitler's trousers when it goes off and doesn't kill him. He also put it down to providence that he had been allowed to survive and therefore to stay in charge, and the Führer was going to save the fatherland and the Reich. So it's not something, I don't want your viewers and listeners to come away thinking that it's a really good thing to think that you're being watched over by a more powerful force who's saving you to become the world-saving figure.
Yeah, it can cut a lot of different ways. Think
sure
of David Koresh and cult leaders and...
Well, exactly that.
Jim Jones down in Ghana or wherever
Precisely.
he was.
All of these frauds and crooks and con men use it as well.
Are there any particular weaknesses or pathologies or failures that come to mind in, say, Churchill and Napoleon or others who helped to make them ultimately great in the ways that they were great?
The key thing is learning from mistakes, which not all politicians do, and he'd scarcely point out. But Churchill certainly did. He made mistake after mistake. He got female suffrage wrong, the abdication crisis that I mentioned earlier. He joined the gold standard at the wrong time, at the wrong level. The Black and Tans in Ireland was a disaster. Primarily, of course, the Dardanelles crisis of 1915 to early 1916, where over 100,000 Allied troops were killed, wounded, or captured. I mean, this was a series of mistakes. In every single one of them, he learnt from those mistakes.
How did he do that? There's probably, I would think, maybe some method behind the madness. Maybe it's just more self-awareness or reflection, but did he have a process for learning?
He wasn't hubristic. That was the key thing. He had, I think it probably helps also, of course, that he was in a democratic system like Napoleon or Hitler, whereby, you know, he was criticised the entire time in the House of Commons for all of those things. He had to defend them and therefore had to, in a logical and rational point, democracy works very well at pricking the pomposity and hubris of people if it's working properly. And Napoleon also learned from mistakes in his military career. And I don't believe that the decision to march on Moscow itself was hubristic. I'm slightly aside from a lot of military historians about this. But just to explain, he'd beaten the Russians twice before. He had an army twice the size of the Russians. He knew perfectly well that the winter was going to come. He stayed too long in Moscow, but if he'd gone to Moscow and then come back again immediately, he would not have had the climactic disasters that overcame him with the blizzards in the October and November of 1812. And so you have this sense that, yes, it was an appalling strategic error, but it wasn't done out of a drive because he thought he was a sort of demigod. That, I think, is a misunderstanding of his personality.
So I'm going to ask something that Neil Ferguson of Colossus on the Shelf put in an email. I would ask Andrew about the diary he keeps, which is a source of intense anxiety.
He's obsessed with this. He is, okay, finish the rest of that.
Which is a source of intense anxiety to all of his friends and even more to his enemies. Best wishes, Neil.
Yeah, well, Neil doesn't care about any of that. He only cares about what I say about him. He is the friend. He is the friend who is obsessed with the diary. Yes, I keep a diary. For God's sake, is it such a crime? You know, we went on the skiing holiday this year, and it's all he talked about. He's obsessed.
Is it the forbidden fruit? I mean, what is the story here?
I think he's kicking himself that he didn't keep one. You know, you think of all these extraordinary people he meets, you know, every time I see him, he's just been talking to President Xi or Bibi Netanyahu or, you know, President of America. And he doesn't write down and keep it all in the diary. So I think there's an element of envy going on here, frankly. But I find it very relaxing and calming to think that my life isn't just going to be a complete waste of time. And one of the only ways that I can
see that.
Thank you. Well, that's kind of you. Thank you. One of the only ways that I can justify this concept that it's all not just a sort of nihilistic sort of maelstrom, boondoggle, exactly, is by writing books, obviously, which I hope will survive me, but also noting down what I've done in the day. But Neil is convinced that every time he says anything embarrassing or something, I'm going to be
just loading the ammo into your diary.
Exactly. And that when we're sort of 80, he's going to go to the bookshop, buy the diary, flick to Ferguson, Neil, and see sort of 40 entries, each of which is going to make his face go redder than
following
the last.
Charges.
Exactly. Which it's not going to be like that at all. What he's actually going to do is to immediately go to the diary and look up Ferguson Neil. But See all the amusing, charming, intelligent remarks he's made, the witticisms, and all that kind of thing. And not just him, obviously, everybody that I've ever met over the last 40 plus years. And
how do you
so
keep
you're
your diary?
You're on your mettle now. You're going to have to, I'm going to say,
I know.
Went on Tim Ferriss's show.
Best behavior.
Exactly. What an idiot.
Note to self, send chocolates to Andrew. Don't forget his birthday. Now, there are many people who keep a diary. How do you keep your diary? Is it a nightly exercise? Is it typed out? Is
no,
it
you mustn't
pen?
do it
Is
nightly.
It quill pen?
You mustn't do it nightly because, or at least you might be able to, but I drink.
Mm-hmm.
And so...
I like drinking.
Good, yeah. And so there's nothing worse than trying to write, if you've been drinking, also writing down the witticisms. Sometimes there's a bit of a problem owing to the fact that I can't read my writing the next morning. But no, it has to be done pretty much the next morning. You can't leave it for 2 weeks or so.
What's your frequency?
Every day.
Every day.
I used to write it. Oh, no, but if nothing interesting has happened, then I won't put anything down.
Nothing to report.
Yeah, no, there's yes. Or like Louis the 16th on the 14th of July, 1789, the day of the fall of the Bastille. All he writes is rien, nothing. So I hope I'm not going to be quite as moronic as that. It's not really intended for publication, which is another thing that Neil doesn't
He's going to
understand.
latch onto that,
but
really part of that sentence. He's going to be like, you see?
Yeah. No, of course he is. But but nonetheless, I do find it. Well, you mentioned earlier about how many words I write. It's never more than about 500 words maximum, and it picks the most interesting part of the day. And if somebody has said or done something interesting, I'll stick it in.
Do you do that before your book writing? Let's say you're on...
Yes,
you do.
First thing in the morning.
All right. And is that just like pajamas, slippers, and a cup of coffee? Or
Yeah, precisely that.
Yeah. All right, great.
Exactly.
Seems like such a ridiculous question, but how do you think about taking breaks when you're writing? I mean, obviously you might have a bathroom break or something like that, but do you build in breaks? Do you ride the flow as long as you have it? What does it look like?
The flow as long as you have it. Absolutely. Yeah. Because it might not come back if you deliberately have breaks. Sometimes, and I'm slightly loath to admit this in public, but nonetheless, sometimes if you are really flowing, I can go without, washing for 3 days. I can be in my dressing gown and slippers. My wife finds it extremely unhygienic and I'm not allowed to sleep in the same bed. But if I'm running, hard at a really difficult chapter and I need to keep my thoughts in order, I will not waste time doing anything. I'll get some breakfast and so on, but that will just be a dash to the kitchen and back again. Because you've got to if something's complicated, and there are lots of occasions, another classic, we go back to the 10th of May 1940, that in my Churchill book, you have to get it right because every minute, not just every hour, every minute something is happening. They're getting news from what the Luftwaffe is attacking, and he's then having to create his government. He then goes off to the House of Commons and so on. It's just relentless. And unless you encapsulate in your mind successfully what is important about that day, you'll never get it over to the reader. And if you're constantly going off and going for a walk or going to the gym or showering or whatever, there's a danger that you're going to fall out of the rhythm of creativity.
How do you think about that flow when you have the flow? I mean,
I hasten to add, it's never more than 3 days I've ever gone without a shower.
I wouldn't judge. I was just on a hiking trip. I went 10 days without showering, so I don't judge. I won't throw stones in my glass house.
Only when I'm writing the book. I hasten to add that as well. God, I don't want people to come up and at parties, hold their nose and go, "Hello, Andrew."
How do you think about that flow with writing? So there's one reason not to interrupt the writing. If you have a hard task ahead of you and you have 47 balls in the air, and if you drop them, you're going to have to start the juggling process all over again. The boot up sequence takes a long time. How do you think about the flow of writing, or that feeling that things are coming to you more easily or moving onto the page more easily?
Sometimes it's a very bad thing. Of course, Dr. Johnson did say, when you have written your most brilliant purple paragraph, read it again and rip it up. So you
Tell
mustn't
me more about that.
Oh yeah, no. Well, if you think that you've just written something completely brilliant, there's a very good chance that it's rubbish, and that it has to be somebody else. It has to be your publisher or some other person who can read it and have a completely objective eye, because there's a very good chance that you're hugging yourself with glee about something that actually you think sounds wonderful, but in fact is complete. It's complete
Be the
rot.
name of my memoir, Hugging Yourself with Glee. And I write that down.
Yeah.
I'll give you your customary 5%. That's fine. If you had to choose, maybe you don't want to choose from your darlings here, but if this question has an answer, you don't even need to name them, but you could keep a person in mind. If you had to choose one person to act as your proofreader for your work, to be that sanity check.
Oh, he's called Stuart Proffitt. He's the most brilliant publisher in London. He's known by everybody to be the most brilliant. He's also the most irritating.
That makes sense to me.
Pedant. Oh my God, for my Napoleon book. He's going to listen to this, so I'm going to have to be as nice as possible. But he's Professor Perfect is my nickname for him, because he's a total professorial figure. And for my Napoleon book, I remember a series of marginalia. Again, this is the thing where you think you've done something rather good, And he writes, one of the things he wrote in the marginalia, "Are you sure this joke is funny?" Nothing more crushing than to have that. He also wrote...
Strikes me as very British.
Exactly. Question mark, And you read it again, and you chortle to yourself, and you go, yes, it is funny. Anyway, damn it. But he wrote, there were a whole series of them in we were talking earlier about the 1796 campaign of Napoleon. He said, how wide was the River Po in 1796? There was another one. Did Napoleon take Herodotus to Egypt? You think, oh my God, damn, I don't know. I'm going to have to find out. He's a genius, but also a very irritating person.
Could you say more about what makes him so good? And I'll buy some time just by saying, if I can't find a writer friend of mine, let's just say, or an editor who can proofread my work, I'll very often give, and I write a particular type of thing, but I will give my chapter, let's just say, to a friend who's a really good lawyer. And part of the reason for that is that they're very good at trimming out excess. And if anything is ambiguous,
or contradictory.
Yeah. They're very good at surgically excising that. What makes this particular gentleman, what was his name again? Stuart
Proffitt.
Great name. What makes Stuart so good at giving feedback? How does he see things differently?
He's a profoundly committed to history. I mean, he loves history. And so he has a sort of higher purpose to try to flood the world with great history books, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest higher purpose that you can have. I mean, it doesn't get better than that. He has a very logical brain. He's very good on syntax. So anything that doesn't sound right in a sentence, he will point out. Sometimes to an infuriating degree.
From a poetic perspective?
From a poetic perspective, yeah. If there's a rhythm that isn't right, or if something rhymes as well, sometimes you can use two words that have a rhyme in them, and he will cut that automatically because it just doesn't feel right.
Sit well with his sensibilities. Precisely.
And mine, I hasten to add, because I very rarely actually disagree with him. I did on the joke, by the way. And whenever anybody tells me that that particular joke is funny, I
forward it to him.
I forward it. I ping the email straight on to Stuart. Of course I do. I'd be mad not to, wouldn't I? I mean, and he's been doing it for 40 years. And he's at the top of his trade. So you would expect him to be really good. But boy, is he.
So those two examples you gave, the width of the river and Herodotus,
yeah.
Why did he ask those two?
Because he is always trying to put himself into the mind of the reader and wondering what the reader would be thinking. And he thought, rightly or wrongly in this case, that the reader would be interested in the width of the river and whether or not Herodotus went with him. But I mean, there are loads more examples like that. I will send him 100 pages and he'll send me back 100 pages of questions and criticisms and remarks. And so I almost sometimes think that I ought to put his name on the front cover of the book. He phoned me up actually about the Napoleon book. And the original of Napoleon just had a huge N on it and lots of B's. And he said, he phoned me up and he said, I've got this idea for the front cover of the book. Your name isn't going to be on it. And he said, and neither is Napoleon's. And I thought, over the phone, I thought, okay, he's finally gone completely mad. Yeah, exactly. No, that's right. Poor man. How long can he stay in his job if he's going to come up with ideas?
Hope he can fake it for a while.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. But it can't be long now, before. And it turned out to be a totally brilliant concept, because if you see a gigantic N with B's, you think of Napoleon.
B's as in... I'm such an idiot. Bees, like honeybees.
Honeybees, yeah. That was his symbol. It was Napoleon's symbol, because they could sting, but they could also give honey. That was the idea. And it just captured people's imagination and sold an awful lot of copies, which was really great. That's sold 500,000 copies, that book now.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That is incredible. Sounds like such a gift to have a Stuart. I need a Stuart.
Yeah, everyone needs a Stuart.
Everyone needs a Stuart.
Don't take mine, but whatever you do.
I don't. I think he might spend his entire first month on just the syntax errors in my first chapter. So
you do want to strangle him, by the way.
This is the sign of a very good proofreader.
Yeah.
Often.
Yeah.
Why do you think it is that some historical figures take on these mythic proportions, where some who have huge impacts seem to sort of fall into obscurity over time? Are there particular characteristics? Is it self-made in a sense, where people create that myth of themselves while they're still alive? How do you think about that?
I haven't thought about that before. That's a really good question. There are some things that are very difficult to get over to people on the printed page. Charisma is one of them. Charm is another one. Sexiness. These are things that we all know from our own lives matter enormously. If somebody's charismatic, charming, and sexy, you're going to want to be interested in them, follow them, and so on, much more than somebody who isn't. And yet explaining how they are, any of those things, very famously hard to explain. And I think the same is true with historical characters. How can it be that this unprepossessing looking American president, who happens to, with his strange beard but not moustache, who happens to be president at the time that the country is falling apart, manages to save the country through this terrible civil war, and then is assassinated right at the end of the Civil War? I mean, the story is so extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah. And yet to explain the charisma and charm, not sexiness, I don't think in Abraham Lincoln's case, but many of your listeners or readers might disagree with you, but nonetheless.
Just imagining him popping up on a dating app.
Right. You swipe right or left for Abe Lincoln. Exactly.
Might ride a fixed gear bike, make expensive cappuccinos. That's kind of the hipster look. Anyway, I digress.
It is difficult to explain how some people just grab the headlines and others don't. I mean, of course, it does help to be a leader in a war. That's true of Lincoln and Churchill and Napoleon and so on. The chance of becoming a world historical figure, if you are Prime Minister of Luxembourg in a time of peace, is going to be much more difficult, of course. But yeah, there doesn't seem to be a hard and fast rule, does there?
Hard and fast recipe. And I can follow. I'm just kidding.
Well, don't take us to war on the back of you wanting to be remembered.
I don't think I'm capable. Certainly not eager. Makes me think of, what is the title of that poem? Ozymandias, look upon my works in despair. I'll leave that alone.
I met a traveller from an antique land who said 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert, and near them on the sand, half shrunk, a shattered visage lies, whose wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tells that its sculpture well those passions read, which yet survive. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look upon my works, ye mighty, in despair. Nothing besides remains round that eternal wreck. Long and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
Hot damn. There you go, listeners.
Can you point out to the listeners that you didn't tell me that this was going to happen?
I did not send a memo in advance. And I suppose the preface to that is that there are these ruins sticking out of the sands. Am I getting
the feet?
there's
feet.
The trunks.
That's
of right.
The trunks of the legs. So there was obviously a huge, magnificent kind of pyramid high, glorious statue to Ozymandias, and now there's nothing, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about not being remembered.
Who is the author of that poem?
Percy Bysshe Shelley.
I saw maybe the original or certainly a first draft in Oxford, because I was going through a program at Wadham College, and there's an exhibit on right now, which is something like cut, paste, rewrite, and it shows the hand-edited works of Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, and all these others, and I came across that.
If anybody wants to see a first edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it's just gone on exhibition at I was there this morning, Lambeth Palace Library. There's a thing called Her Book. It's about early female writers. It's a brilliant exhibition. And so if there's anyone in London who's interested in seeing that book, it's there today.
Beautiful. And if you're near Oxford, Weston Library has the exhibit that I was mentioning. A lot of gems. You have some really fun old stuff in the UK, it turns out.
Thank you. I'm not going to take that personally.
No. That's a compliment. Yeah, old in the US is like 1970.
I thought you were talking about me.
Oh,
no. Oh, good. All right.
Not you. How do you think about legacy? Because along the lines of the Ozymandias piece, I'm like, is it just sort of hubris to believe in the first place that that's something worth aspiring to, having something last and stand the test of time? I mean, how do you personally think about this, especially as someone who studies history?
I obviously do want people to read my books long after I've died.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not going to know whether they are or not. So why on earth? It just seems so illogical to even think that, doesn't it? That it should matter to me that anything happens the second after I've, died. But I know that I do, and it is one of the drives for being a writer, because words always live forever, and they're virtually the only thing that does. Ozymandias' statue is just two trunkless legs of stone, whereas actually his words, look upon my works, ye mighty in despair, that goes to the heart of the human condition. And Shelley's poetry still survives in a way that Ozymandias' statue doesn't. So there is something about words that are immortal, and we're all sort of grasping for immortality in one way or another, aren't we?
Yeah, it is true. Do you read fiction?
Yes, I do. When I go on holiday, which is usually hiking, actually, with my wife, she loves going to places that involve mountains. Mm-hmm. And in order to get history completely out of my system for the 2 weeks or so that we're hiking, I do read fiction. Sometimes if I want to completely clear my brain, I'll have a detective novel. And I've chosen the most complicated of all of the detective novelists, a chap called Robert Goddard. Have you ever heard of Robert Goddard?
I have not.
So complicated to work out who done it or what groups of people done it. It's very rarely just one person, and why. And I try and make notes in the back of the book, connecting each person to everybody else. And so by the end of it, it looks like one of those really complicated sort of management.
It's like an org chart.
Yeah, exactly. With hundreds of people connecting to everybody else to try and work out who done it. And he always beats me.
Yeah, that sounds fun.
But as far as sort of high culture novels are concerned, I will occasionally do that. I'm president of the Cliveden Literary Festival, and so we have lots of novelists come to that. And so if you've got William Boyd or Salman Rushdie or somebody who you're going to be bumping into at the festival, it's always a good idea to read their latest novel. We had Robert Harris recently, and that's always well worth doing. And then there are a few writers like Michel Houellebecq, who is just so great that you have to sort of read whatever he brings out.
I don't recognize the name. I'm embarrassed to say.
He's a French writer. It's pronounced Houellebecq. He's a genius, very controversial and quite unpopular in France. And the latest one I'm reading is where it features his own murder. It's a great satire. It's a very, very funny.
Is there a book you might suggest starting with? If I were going to start with one of
The Map and the Territory.
the map of the territory?
The Map and the Territory
okay.
of Michel Houellebecq. The name starts Helle.
I'll find them.
It's a sort of satire on French intellectual customs and
I can see them
individuals.
loving that.
It's very funny. It's very funny.
Why is he controversial?
Because he's deeply politically incorrect as well. He just doesn't care.
Great.
He just doesn't care what he writes. He's a honey badger in that sense. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
He's a literary honey badger is Houellebecq.
Very honey badger. All right. So speaking of politically incorrect, how should we, in your mind, write about imperial history?
We should try as far as possible to be genuinely objective. We shouldn't take the assumption that all white people, whenever they went abroad, did so solely in order to rape, murder, massacre, and exploit. Because certainly in the latter part, we were talking earlier about Winston Churchill and the noblesse oblige, the concept that it was part of your duty as a privileged person to try to make the world a better place for other less privileged people. And that was, especially in the latter part of the British Empire, a driving force for a lot of people, especially obviously missionaries and Christians, but also other people, explorers and people who were involved in agriculture and so on. They actually were not driven by rapacity and greed in the way that essentially the Marxist analysis of imperialism has made out. So be objective. Some of those people were like that, undoubtedly, of course they were. Especially some of the people in Southern Africa and elsewhere. But for a long period of the story of the British Empire, for much of that empire, it actually was a force for human good rather than evil.
What do you see as the challenges moving forward for the capturing of history, and/or how do you see it changing as we move forward?
I am quite worried about it in Britain because, first of all, fewer and fewer people seem to be taking it as a subject at university level. Secondly, we have this thing, it's nicknamed Henry to Hitler, where we jump from the Tudors to the Second World War, and we don't do the very important intervening stages of the Stuarts, the Civil War, the Hanoverians, loss of America, really anything up to the outbreak of the First World War. And there's so much of really important history in that period that we seem to jump from one to the next. There was a survey quite recently of British teenagers, quite a big survey, over 1,000 of them. And 20% of them thought, it was like 23% of them, thought that the American War of Independence was won by Denzel Washington.
And the Americans get a bad rap.
Yeah,
So,
I know, exactly.
It's not just us.
No. And also, there were 20% of these kids, these are British school kids, who also thought that Winston Churchill was a fictional character and that Sherlock Holmes and Eleanor Rigby were real people. So whatever's going on in British history teaching, I think there's still a lot to be desired.
If you had never been able to write any books in that alternate reality, what have you personally, or what would you have gained personally from studying history?
Well, it's a lot of things, isn't it? History. It can be a bit of a quicksand.
In what sense?
Well, as soon as you think you understand a period, all it takes is one new set of papers or a new book written by somebody else, a friends especially, that can make you look again at the same period and completely change your mind about it. And that's a little unnerving at the age of 61, I have to say. I'm just reading Ronald Hutton's second volume of his life of Oliver Cromwell, which has just been published. And I'd always thought of Cromwell as somebody who had a set of principles that he moulded his times around in order to see through. And Ronald Hutton has completely exploded that thesis for me. And I realized that he was, like most politicians, just sort of grabbing the coattails of history and hanging on as much as he could. And yes, he was a good soldier and so on, but he was, in terms of his politics, he was constantly trying to create alliances, of course, like all politicians do, but when opportunities came, he grabbed them. But he was at the mercy of events much more than creating them. Whereas I had for years had the sort of image of Oliver Cromwell, like that statue outside Parliament, of this incredibly sort of solid figure. He wasn't like that at all.
What are other things that attract you or attracted you to history?
It wasn't just Christopher Perry. My dad read history at Oxford, and he used to take me around castles. We go on holiday to, Wales and see the great Edward I castles. And he would chat on journeys, we'd chat about history and what ifs, the counterfactuals and things like that. And so I grew up feeling very comfortable with it and recognizing that it's a beautiful and fascinating thing. Whereas I think sometimes some people can be not scared of history, but they can be put off history because they weren't taught it very well at school, or they just thought it was a succession of dates, or they can't see any relevance to their daily lives and so on. And I've never been one of those people.
So if you were doing a presentation, could be anywhere, on why people, aside from conflating, Denzel Washington with other historical figures, why they should read history or engage with history, what would the thrust of the presentation be?
I suppose it does come back to that Aldous Huxley quote, about trying to learn some of the lessons. There's a marvellous moment in June 1953, at the time of the late Queen's coronation. Winston Churchill is walking across Westminster Hall, this fabulous, great hall that was, when it was built in the late 13th century, the largest room in Europe. And it's fused with history. It's, of course, where Churchill himself was to lie in state, but also where the monarchs lie in state, where Warren Hastings went on trial and Charles I went on trial, and people like Mandela and Zelensky have given speeches and things like that. It's compounded. This Sir Thomas More went on trial there, the Earl of Strafford. I just mentioned a whole load of people who were all decapitated, actually. William Wallace as well, he was decapitated as well. And so you've got this sense of all of British history, summed up in a room, essentially. And a young American student stops Churchill and asks essentially for a piece of life advice. And Churchill replies, study history, for therein lies all the secrets of statecraft. And that would be one of the reasons that I would tell people, that if you want to understand what's going on in the world, you do have to look and see what has happened before. And there's no person who doesn't want to have a better understanding of what's going on in the world, or try to work out for themselves the great forces in our planet today. So that, I suppose, would be the answer. That's why I've chosen study history as my motto of my coat of arms, for example, and why I've got a podcast too, and I call it Secrets of Statecraft. I think that's a sort of motivating factor.
Secrets of Statecraft. That is...
It's the Hoover Institution's podcast, but it's great fun to do. Must have Neil Ferguson on at some stage, and I can tease him about not keeping a diary.
What is statecraft? Just so I think I know, but I want to. Very often, I think I know something, and it is in fact not true at all. So
it's the ability to run a country.
To run a country,
yes. So you've got to juggle the diplomatic, the military, the economic, the cultural, all of these things, the religious, all of these things together to create the kind of country that you want it to be. And that is statecraft. And so it's been going on as long as human history has, and always will.
Looking forward, let's see, you've studied many great figures from history. You've looked at these different chapters of... Including
your late king, your last king, George III. I wrote a biography of him a few years ago, which was great fun to do. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
Oh, no, that's all right. I was just going to ask you, looking forward, given how much you've reflected backwards, Where do you think things are going for the UK and or for the US? Like if you were a betting man and you say, there's a good chance, it's not a certainty, but if the dominoes continue to fall the way they're falling, A, B, or C. Do you have any?
I'm afraid I'm a bit of a pessimist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not so much for the United States because you're still such a rich and innovative country. But I'm wondering in Britain whether or not, and history plays an important part of this, especially the way in which history is used politically, to wonder whether or not we still believe in ourselves, certainly in the way that we did when I was growing up. I'm going to try and get the statistics right. I think it's 2015, as recently as 2015, maybe it's 2010, 86% of people were proud of British history. That has now fallen down to 56%. And I'm sure that the reason for this is the sustained attack on the British Empire that we were discussing earlier, and people forgetting the part that we played in the abolition of slavery and concentrating just on the horrors and the monstrous things that happened. And we are therefore, if you're not proud of your past, you're not proud of your ancestors, you're not proud of the things that they produced, and Britain has produced some pretty extraordinary and wonderful things for the world, then it's difficult to see why anyone would want to be proud of the future of the country as well. And so I'm pretty pessimistic. And when I feel pessimism for America, it's for things like taking Thomas Jefferson's statue down from the New York City Hall. And it's a form of cultural suicide, it strikes me, not to admire the founders of your nation. And yes, of course, he owned slaves, but he also wrote a constitution that has survived for a quarter of a millennium. And he was brave enough, and Washington and all the others, brave enough to stand up against the most powerful empire in the world. Now, these things, you deserve your statue, it seems to me. And if you go around pulling these things down, I think you're breaking a kind of living link with the past that makes you a great country. And that's certainly happening in this country as well. And I mean, I'm a bit of a pessimist anyway because I'm a Tory, and pessimism is an essential part of Toryism. I'm not as big a pessimist, I hasten to add, as Neil Ferguson, who I like to say it's never terribly difficult to tell it's a quote from P.G. Wodehouse, never terribly difficult to tell the difference between a ray of sunshine and a Scotsman with a grievance. And Neil always tells you that it's all doom and gloom and everything's going to be utterly disastrous. I wonder whether or not he truly believes it, because he's actually himself a very upbeat and personally sort of positive individual who does lots of things that imply that actually he does think the world's going to get better. But boy, oh boy.
How do you personally, if you do, I mean, it seems like you examine, or you have a fascination with counterfactuals, the what ifs. You read books that have the potential for upending sort of long-held theses, which can be uncomfortable, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Do you have people around you or who you deliberately expose yourself to who offset perhaps some of your pessimistic tendencies with forms of optimism that they can defend?
Yes, my wife is the classic example. She's optimistic about the future. She's in business. She's a very successful businesswoman. So she actually sees a lot of the things that are being, innovations that are taking place, the drugs that are coming online that are, saving lives and taking on, defeating pain and so on, She's great at believing in the innate capacity of capitalism to reinvent itself in a positive way for more and more people and take people out of poverty and all of those positive things. So yes, it's an invigorating thing to talk about the world with her, because it makes me much less sort of Eeyore-like and Ferguson-esque.
I feel like Any other inside scoop that people should know about Neil? What are
No,
his secret optimistic voice memos that he sends you? You can add to your diary. Please see audio reference 47. Well, Andrew, this has been great fun. You have many books that people can read, certainly, and they'll all be in the show notes. But is it most recent, Conflict?
That's a book I wrote with David Petraeus. And of course, him being a general who's commanded armies of over 160,000 in both Iraq and Afghanistan has been so fascinating intellectually for me, because of course I'm a military historian. I've never worn a uniform for 1 minute. So that was great.
The subtitle for folks, just so they have that, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine.
Well, it's now actually Gaza. The paperback takes us
Gaza.
up to Gaza as well, about halfway through that campaign in Gaza. And yeah, it was after the Russian invasion of Ukraine that I came up with the idea of writing the book. And I got on to David, who I knew, and said, why don't we write this as a military history? There are going to be lots of political histories about this, but just, the military side of it. And put it into the context of all the wars that have happened since 1945. So we go through, not all of them, there are 400 of them, but all the key ones, the 40 or so key ones that you'll have heard of, and that show how war has evolved and developed. And sometimes it leaps forward and other times it goes into sort of sideshows. But we went to the publishers and they quite understandably said, well, how are you going to divvy up the chapters? And I said, well, David's going to write about all the countries he's invaded. and I'll fill in the rest. And he also did the Vietnam chapter as well, actually. And then we sent hundreds, maybe thousands of emails to one another over the course of the year or so that we were writing it.
That's very fast.
It is fast. But the thing
How
was,
did you do it so quickly?
Well, because the situation in Ukraine was moving so quickly. And then the Gaza war broke out on the day of the publication of the hardback. So that was literally the 7th of October that we were bringing that out. So we then needed to get on with writing about that as well. And as you know, I tend to write quickly.
Yeah.
And so does he. He's a soldier scholar. He went to your old university. He was at Princeton doing a postgrad on military history. So he very much able to keep sending back those emails.
Yeah. I suppose he's not lacking discipline. Would
that again.
Would be my guess.
Yeah.
What did you find were key ingredients to that successful collaboration? What made it work, especially with that type of pressure under deadline?
Well, I think there was mutual respect, which is very important. I'd never written a book with anybody before. And I'm
in the midst of doing that right now, which is part of the reason I'm asking.
Yeah, no, well, it's slightly nerve-wracking, isn't it? Because one can get very sort of proprietorial about one's work. But that wasn't the case with David, because the insights that he gave about what it was like to be a commander in two wars at the absolute apex of command meant that he could then look back on wars like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Iraq One, and other wars, to the Gulf War, to sort of place himself in the position of Matthew Ridgway, in Korea, for example. And that was so fascinating that I knew that there was nothing that I could add to that. I just knew that the combination of the soldier and the historian would produce something that was really intellectually stimulating for me. And that's, in the end, life is a constant battle against boredom, isn't it? It's a constant rearguard action against not being stimulated.
Yeah. Do you think you will do more collaborations? How are you thinking about your writing moving forward?
No, I know my next two books are just going to be written by me. I've got Napoleon and his marshals, about how the emperor interacted with his marshals and how the marshals interacted with each other. They fortunately all hated each other, so that's much easier for a historian to write something interesting. And hated each other in very imaginative way.
The greatest reality TV show never seen.
Yes, exactly. And then after that, I'm doing Disraeli, and he's an extraordinary character who was a complete outsider as a Jew, of course. Didn't go to one of the British public schools or Oxford and Cambridge or at any university, and through his own brilliance, and he was a novelist, of course, also, his own wit, he wound up becoming the most powerful man in the world.
Yeah, I look forward to reading that one.
Good, thank you. Let me back on the show in 2030, which is when it's being published.
I hope I'll still be around. We'll see. I've been here for a decade. We'll see how it goes. Andrew, this has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time. People can find you. Correct me if I get any of this wrong. Andrew-roberts.net. Would that be the main website? That's what I have here.
Can't remember, but yes, I hope so.
Let's just say that's right. And if it's not, I'll put correct version in the show notes. Is Twitter, or X as it stands now, a good place for people to follow you as well?
Yeah, that has things like my podcast and so on.
Perfect. So that's, as I have it here, @Roberts_Andrew.
Is it good?
Perfect. We'll fact check all of that. But we do have that. Is there anything else that you would like to add? Any requests of my audience? Anything at all that you'd like to mention?
Just thank you so much, Tim, for being on the show. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. This has really been great. And for people who are listening, as always, you can find the show notes at tim.blog/podcast. We will include links to everything we discussed. And also, as always, until next time, just be a little kinder than is necessary to others, but also to yourself. Thanks for tuning in.